Hello everyone, and welcome back to Conspiraseed. This week we'll be talking about something that I had actually heard about a little while ago, wrote down on my phone, and then forgot about. This is something that I actually found super interesting and had quickly become one of my favorite topics, just because of the actual fear that I felt while reading about this for the first time. The mystery surrounding the case is palpable. That being said, thank you so much for choosing to spend some time with me today, and let's just get into it.
Nothing like being subscribed to Conspiraseed on YouTube. Nothing like it.
March 19th, 1967, in the small town of Manhattan, Montana, two boys were playing on a bridge above a river. One of the boys, Bernard Pullman, climbed onto one of the bridge's pillars, standing above the river on a railing. He looked at his friend as he held a rock, ready to drop it in the icy river below, and said, "Check this out." In that moment, a little pop rang out through the woods nearby, and Bernard fell forward off the railing and into the water below. A search party was out looking for him as soon as they could. They set up a net in the next city over, in the river, as a catch-all, hoping that if he was still in the river, they could at least catch the body. Months go by, and there's no sign of the child, dead or alive. The town by this point is starting to think that an accident happened. The kid just lost his footing, he fell into the river, and passed away, just couldn't find him. Whatever the reasoning, the town wrote it off as an accident, and didn't really think about it anymore. Then, his body was found. His body was found on some rocks, just a few hundred feet away from where he fell off at the bridge. They were able to determine that he was shot in the head with a .22, and died pretty instantly. Now, the town still thought this was an accident at most. No way there was a murder so heinous in their small town. A bullet from a hunter must have ricocheted off a tree and struck the boy. The town quickly forgot about the incident and went on as normal. A little over a year later, on May 6th, 1968, there was a Boy Scout camping trip at the Headwater State Park. With over 200 scouts and 20 adult leaders from the Yellowstone Valley District, the tents were mere feet apart, and a 12-year-old named Michael Rainey was only a few tents away from his scout leader, about 30 feet total. No horseplay past bedtime, obviously, as the scout leaders would hear him and his tent mate easily. They went to bed on May 6th, and when Michael's tent mate woke up to the sun, he looked over to see that Michael was still asleep. That's when his tent mate looked down and saw the blood just outside of his sleeping bag. He started trying to wake Michael up, pushing him and saying his name. Michael wasn't waking up, however. He ran for his scout leaders, begging for help. His scout leaders ran to his and Michael's tent and also tried to wake him. They also noticed a lot of blood pooled around the top of Michael's sleeping bag, but they noticed that Michael was still breathing. The authorities showed up and took Michael to the hospital. While the police were still looking at the scene, they noticed the tent had a slit cut right where Michael was sleeping. At the hospital, they assessed Michael's wounds and noticed that he had a cut in his armpit and a little bump on his head behind his ear. The cut under the armpit is where all the blood came from, and it punctured his lung. It's determined that this happened in the early morning of May 7th, which is interesting because it didn't wake anyone up. Not the scout leaders, not his tent mate, not any of the scouts in the tents around them. Sadly, a few days later, Michael Rainey passed away in the hospital. Oddly enough, it wasn't the stab wound that killed him, but the little bump behind his ear. While they're not sure what caused the little bump, about the size of a quarter, it liquefied part of his brain. People were obviously scared. This was the second mysterious death in the area in a little over a year. While the two deaths didn't seem related or connected in any way, it's certainly a worrying trend that the town people noticed. The police had everyone that was at the camp take a lie detector test, as well as have their knives checked to see if there was a match for the wound or the tent laceration. It's a Boy Scout camp. Pretty much everyone there has a knife. Over 200 lie detector tests and over 200 knives checked later, the police had no leads. None of the kids failed at the lie detector, and none of the knives were a match, or had any of Michael's DNA on it. The town would soon quiet back down. The Yeager family, from Michigan, had planned a month-long vacation, including stops in Montana, to camp at the Headwaters State Park. If this sounds familiar, it's because that's where Michael Rainey was just murdered. It's been 5 years since Michael was killed, however. The year is now 1973. June 24th, 1973, the Yeager family goes to bed. The oldest child slept in the van, while the parents and two other children slept in the tent. At 4 a.m., Heidi Yeager woke up and noticed that a hole had been cut in the side of the tent, and her younger sister Susan age 7, was missing. Heidi immediately woke her parents up. Her parents started searching for her immediately. Any thought that she had just wandered off had been abandoned when they saw the hole in the side of the tent, and any little dwindle of hope that she had just wandered off had been killed once they found her stuffed animals on the ground just a short distance away. The father drove to the closest phone and called the police. Ironically, the Jaeger's tent was set up mere feet from where Michael Rainey was camping on that fateful night in 1968. The FBI was contacted, since kidnappers will often cross state lines and the Jaegers were from Michigan, so the state police would have just been too little. There appeared to be no clues or evidence as to what could have happened to little Susan. Once her stuffed animals were dropped, there were no more prints or leads. 3 days after the kidnapping, a man called one of the FBI offices in Denver, Colorado, claiming that he had been the man who kidnapped Susan and demanded $25,000 in ransom money. On July 2nd, just a few days later, the Gallatin County Sheriff's Deputy Ron Brown received a similar call. This time, however, the caller demanded $50,000. When asked if he could prove that he had Susan, he said that she had humpy fingernails on one of her index fingers. The mom, when she heard this, almost burst into tears, as her daughter was born with a physical condition that caused one of her index fingers to have a hump under the fingernail. The police agreed to the ransom amount. They filled a briefcase with fake money to take to the drop-off point. The Jaeger children were very involved and even helped make some of the fake money. The detectives dropped off the briefcase at the drop point and set a stake out. No one ever came to collect the money. It's now been 3 months, and on September 24th, the kidnapper called the Jaeger family home and talked to Susan's older brother, 16-year-old Daniel. The kidnapper referred to previous calls to the sheriff and the FBI to prove that it was him. The FBI had wiretapped the Jaeger's phone, so all their phone calls would be recorded. Daniel asked the kidnapper when he could see his sister, and the kidnapper responded, "Not yet, but soon." Daniel asked why. "Bring her back. Is she safe?" The kidnapper did indeed say that she was safe. Daniel asked to talk to her, and the kidnapper said no, and Daniel once again asked why. The phone call was pretty much Daniel giving the third degree to the kidnapper, and the kidnapper explaining that he can't give Susan back and that she can't come to the phone, but she is safe. Using the wiretap, the FBI managed to trace the call to a gas station in Cheyenne, Wyoming. However, by the time they got to the station, the security camera footage for the day had been recorded over, and they couldn't get any information from it. It had been almost 3 weeks since the call. People in town were scared again, and remembering back to the Michael Rainey case. Police asked anyone for clues, and a name that had come up from multiple people was David Meyerhofer. David was a quiet man. He mostly kept to himself and didn't like to talk about his time in the Vietnam War. Which, to be honest, is not that surprising. However, during this time, if you were a quiet dude who kind of kept to yourself, that was considered weird and bizarre. No one ever said that he committed a crime or that they had any issues with him, just that he was odd. He always cooperated with the police when asked and was questioned multiple times. The only thing the police deemed odd was that he wouldn't take a polygraph test for personal reasons. However, any smart person knows you should never take a polygraph test for any reason because they're very inaccurate. They're so inaccurate that they're inadmissible in court. You cannot use them in court. There's no point to have a polygraph other than try to convince you to confess. So, never take a polygraph test, no matter what. Despite having no history of crime, David kept showing up as a person of interest when asked around town. Police began to really zero in on him after the disappearance of 19-year-old Sandra Dykeman Small again. She was a pretty girl, had a lot of suitors, and got good grades. David was one of her suitors and went on one date with her. They kept in communication, but Sandra wasn't feeling it and eventually told him so. She later went missing. In February of 1974, about 1,200 skeletal fragments were found in a barn on an abandoned ranch called the Lockhart Place in Three Forks, Montana. Following forensic examination, it was determined that the fragments belonged to 2 separate victims. The first victim being a young girl, between the ages of 6 and 8, and the other being a woman between the ages of 18 and 20. Now these bone ages match both Susan, who was 7, and Sandra, who was 19. 4 months after finding the bones, on June 25th, the kidnapper once again called the Jaegers. He spoke to the mother for about an hour, and during this time he reaffirmed that it was him by describing Susan's appearance, and ended the phone call by saying that he was not going to return her, and that he was her new family, and that she had forgotten all about the Jaegers. A few days later, authorities were contacted by a Three Forks resident who reported a bill for a phone call made out of state on June 25th, which he had not made. While the police were investigating the telephone cables, they found a voice gateway and other devices that were built into a brake line, which they suspected the kidnapper had used to make the call. Using the information they had, the FBI made a profile for the kidnapper. This is actually the first time that the FBI used a technique very common today in profiling. So if you know anything about FBI profilers, this is all due to this case. The profile for the kidnapper was a white man between the ages of 25 and 30, likely local to the area, with a background in either telecommunications or the military, and a known social outcast who had problems interacting with others. Police noted that David Meyerhofer matched their profile. A person matching David's description had also made frequent trips to Three Forks, where he carried out construction and installation work at various ranches, including the Lockhart place, where the bones had been found. After the police checked his travel schedule, they were able to place him in Wyoming in September of 1973 due to a receipt found from a Cheyenne auto shop for September 24th, which is the same day that the Jaegers received the call from Cheyenne, Wyoming. Based on this evidence, David was arrested in August of 1974. He protested, claiming that he was innocent and that he was not responsible for the abduction. At this point, since he was arrested, he agreed to a polygraph test in which the results were inconclusive. Because they didn't have any concrete evidence, they ultimately released him without any charges. However, the police took the audio recordings from the interrogation to the Jaeger family. Both the mom and the son were able to listen to the recordings and said that this was the voice of the man that they talked to on the phone. Later, the kidnapper called the Jaegers again, saying that his name was Travis. He said they would never see their daughter alive again due to their cooperation with the police. Unknown to him, however, the FBI was monitoring the call. They positively ID'd David based on his voice and arrested him the next day. After his arrest, the police searched David's house and car. In them, they found bloody women's clothing, washed bloodstains, and a human hand with several fingers. He also had a refrigerator full of wrapped meat. Some were labeled deer, but some were also labeled SDS and SJ. The theory is that this stands for Sandra Dykeman Smolligan and Susan Jaeger. So while it's never been proved, it's very possible that he was eating them as well. David confessed to the killings of Susan and Sandra. He also took a plea deal to avoid being sentenced to death. In the plea, he would also confess to 2 other murders that the police had no leads or clues for, and one of them they even thought was an accident. The murders mentioned earlier of Bernard Pullman on the bridge and Michael Rainey at the campsite. He said he wanted to kill a little kid and saw the kids playing on the bridge and just happened to have the .22 rifle on him and decided that today was the day. He then saw the Boy Scouts camping and decided that he would take one of them as well. He was meant to take Michael instead of killing him, but messed up and hit him in the head and left instead. They recorded the confession as part of the plea deal and sent him back to his cell. 4 hours later, he was found dead in his cell. He had hanged himself with his bed sheets and had strangled himself to death. With his death, to the grave goes the motivation for his murders, which has never been established. Well, that is the story and mystery of the first FBI profile and the lesser-known serial killer, David Meyerhofer. What do you think about what happened? Kind of crazy, huh? Kind of crazy that a bunch of random killings ended up being related. Anyway, thank you so much for watching. Thank you for choosing to spend some time with me today. And as always, I'll catch you in the next one.